So my name is Charlotte Bucken. I'm from Germany originally. I studied in the Netherlands, so I did my undergrad there in Maastricht, specifically in liberal arts and sciences. From there I worked a little bit in a forensic hospital and then decided to study forensic psychology for my master's. I recently completed my PhD in Belgium and in the Netherlands, which was about the effects of denials, so saying that something did not happen even though it did, on memory for traumatic events in the courtroom. Now I'm a postdoc researcher at KU Leuven, and I continue looking at how victims of abuse are interviewed, how we can improve these interviews, for example, by trying to reverse influences that happened before these interviews, and by looking at interactions between the interviewer and the children. In my undergrad, I had quite a broad education because it was in liberal sciences. There it was really possible to study very interdisciplinary, which I think already sparked my interest to try to combine different fields. Specifically, actually, when I was a bachelor student, I had a course called legal psychology in the courtroom, I think. And Henry gave a lecture there, Henry Otzka, and he talked about false memories, and that really sparked my interest. And that's something that was kind of going recurrent through my papers, and that was something I was very interested in, which I then continued working on. I think especially wrongful convictions and the legal consequences for me were. I had a very nice opportunity after my bachelor. It was an intern of sorts in a forensic mental hospital back in Germany, and that was the first time I think that I was actually in contact with patients who have come in contact with the law in situations where they were influenced by their psychological illness. And that's something that really marked my journey, I think, because that really made me realize how important this work is, but also how malleable memory really is, because I worked with patients who have schizophrenia form disorders, for example. You see that their reality really is very different to our reality, and that can really affect how people behave. And I think seeing it firsthand had a very big impact. I don't work as much now in the therapeutic area of forensic psychology. I work more in legal psychology, so looking at cognitive effects. But that also really puts into perspective victimhood, for example, and who is a victim, and how they come forward about certain things that happen to them, which is something I also saw in the hospital. The idea is that when we deny something traumatic that happened to us, that this can affect especially our memory for previous discussions surrounding this. Yeah. So, for example, oftentimes when someone has experienced a negative event, eventually they might be questioned about it by the police or other authorities. And when being questioned, sometimes victims, even if they have previously come forward, they might deny that something happened to them. And what we see is that if they do come forward later on, they're more prone to having forgotten what they discussed in this interview. So their memory for these conversations is a bit worse. And in court, for example, people are oftentimes asked to give conversational testimony, so testimony about these kind of previous conversations, and that can be used as a way to gauge how reliable the witness is when they talk about the events that happened. And what I found in my research is that even though people who have denied falsely, even though it actually happened to them, they remember less details, so they make more mistakes about the conversations and what they've discussed, but they will still remember at least the important details from the event quite well. So the memory for the event seems to remain untouched. And they might be a little bit more prone to false memories for events that are peripheral to the traumatic event, but the actual core of what happened seems to remain intact. In everyday events, someone denies that something happened to them, and later on they do tell another friend, for example, then kind of the same thing can happen. So denial-induced forgetting effects have also been found in conversations about everyday events. They've been found in memory for pictures or memory for videos. So in many different contexts, in an everyday situation, if you forget a little bit of what you talked about with your friend, that might not really be that impactful, or it might not really have any consequences for you. So it's really if it happens in contexts such as in a legal context, where it's very important to remember accurately what happened and to remember previous conversations accurately, that's when it's important. Because in everyday situations, we're generally relatively bad at remembering our conversations. So, I mean, it's a little bit difficult because you can't tell someone, oh, your memory will be a bit worse if you deny, so you should always be honest. It could also be that people are not really aware that this is something they're doing, right? So it could be that it's really their response and they're just trying not to think about it. They're trying to pretend that it didn't happen. I think it would be more helpful to educate people involved in the legal systems on how these denials can affect memory reliability and testimonies that are later on being given in court. The memory for the core details of the traumatic events are still intact. That's something that should be taken into account, so that they're still probably reliable witnesses, even if they have denied previously. And to preface, I'm going to say something that a lot of researchers are probably going to say, which is that the research I've conducted so far needs some sort of replication by independent groups in order for us to really say that it has a certain kind of impact in court, for example. So you could say that there really are implications for how conversational testimony should be used in court. So just because someone's memory for previous conversations is not as good, that is not an indication of their memory for the event itself. So it's important to keep these two separate from each other. Sometimes currently memory for conversations is being taken as an indicator for how well memory for events might be. That's one of the reasons sometimes that people are asked who they have talked to about their experiences before, what they have told the police, and then if what they say is not in line with what the police said, then this is something that will be highlighted. So that this could be a problem for how reliable the witness is seen to be or how valid their accounts are seen to be in courts. But that should not really be reflected upon each other. So memory for the conversation should really be seen as separate from memory for the event. I think that's something that we can say based on this. I'm actually doing some research now looking into how interviewers respond to denials in children. Because they can either respond by accepting when the child denies, or when the child is avoidant for coming forward by moving on, or to other topics, for example, or they might reject it by just asking the same question again. What is currently being recommended is that questions should not be asked repeatedly, because that might be suggestive. Interviewers should be more accepting of these kind of avoidant responses so that they're not being suggestive. Other recommendations are that if a child is quite reluctant to come forward, the interview is kind of stopped. Just use a first interview to build more rapport with the child, and then move on later on in a second interview to more abuse-related content. I think it's very difficult because you have to walk the line between wanting someone to feel comfortable in coming forward and not asking questions that might be suggestive and that might lead to false reports. So I think actually current guidelines are pretty good at trying to go about this. I think if you're really interested in psychology and you might want to do research, it's such a great field to get into. There's so many different things you can explore. I also definitely recommend trying to get into research early on if that's something that you might be interested in, and just to see if you like it, right? To start as a research assistant. Psychology is such a broad field that allows for so many interesting subfields to explore that I think that's really great. A lot of the research currently on interviewing and so on is focused on how interviews themselves are conducted, but there's many things that can affect testimony before the interview even happens. So I think this is something that we should look at a little bit more, and something that I'm also trying to explore a bit now. If there's a way to deal with suggestive influences, for example, that someone has been exposed to before the interview takes place. This also ties in, I guess, to the research I did for my thesis, which was also about something that happened before the interview, for example. So if a child denied already in advance, and then maybe again in the interview, and then comes forward, how this whole process can affect memory. And I think this is something that there is not that much research on, but that's equally as important as how the interview is actually conducted, is what happened before and how might that have shaped the testimony being given or the interview that happened. So this is something I want to focus on more now in my research.
Lead and innovate.